You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith-Baker.
So, Mary, welcome to Conversations with Chanda. I'm so happy to be talking with you today.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. I listen to your podcast all the time, and I'm just excited to talk to you about our work.
Good deal. I mean, it's an interesting time for us to have this conversation because the country is sort of in all kinds of different places emotionally following the election. And I guess I'll just jump in and just ask you, like, how are you feeling, like, in your body about the election? And then how are you feeling about the work?
Yeah, that's a great question because I am very good at compartmentalizing. And so, for instance, the day after the election, I was already into, hey, how are we going to do? What are we going to do? And other people were like, I'm falling apart here. I can't do this. And so it was really good for me to take a step back and make sure people here had their space and that I took time to think about how I feel, because a significant part of Project 2025 is targeting what they refer to as radical Marxist Soros-funded prosecutors, which I'm sure, they'll take a look at me and other people I know. So I recognize in my career, I'm very good at compartmentalizing, and I need to feel my feelings more and process more, because that's much more healthy than just stuffing it aside, because as you know, you feel it in your body anyway. Your body doesn't stuff it anywhere else. So it's been really good for me to take a step back and have lots of conversations about how people are feeling, and to think about how I'm feeling, and to think about what it's going to be like moving forward.
It's interesting that you said you put things in compartments. So I'm pretty much like that as a leader too, and have had to learn some tools and tricks along the way, because I can be very much like what's next and not necessarily celebrating what is happening in the immediate sense. And so I know that your leadership has sometimes been challenging. Do you think that there's part of it is because you do put things in compartments? Do you feel misunderstood ever as a leader? I know most of us do.
Of course. I mean, there were many people who had stereotypes, and they had in their minds when I came into this office that I was going to do certain things. And I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding. When I came in here, I was perfectly clear on the fact that this was a very different role than that of the public defender. And I knew that. I spent a lot of time soul searching and thinking about, is this a job that I can do? And so I knew coming in here, my focus had to be on public safety. And I think where people kind of get confused about it is that when I'm focusing on public safety, I look at data, I look at research, and I understand that the criminal legal system has, even though it says that, and people say that all the time, it has not been effective in terms of public safety, and it's done tremendous damage to Black and Brown people. And so I think sometimes people struggle with, when I'm talking about certain approaches, thinking that that's somehow light on crime, or that is not about public safety. And so I think what I struggled with early on was getting that message out. In my first year, we continue to, I'm coming up on my second year, we do send a lot of people to prison. And that's not something I am happy about. That should never be a happy experience. It's a tragic thing for everyone involved. It certainly never brings, if somebody's been harmed, it doesn't restore them. But our comms people would say to me, X TV station wants to interview you about sending so-and-so to prison. And I rejected that. I didn't want to do it because what I had seen in the past was more of a celebratory name calling kind of thing. And I never felt that way about it. And what I realized was that we do use every tool we have, and that includes incapacitation or prison. I don't like the way prisons are. I don't feel good about sending to prison, even though I know they're not safe in the community and they need to be there to protect others. But I can talk about it in terms of compassionate accountability. And I think we're doing a much better job about that. And we've had some press conferences where we've talked about, we have sent somebody to prison on an intimate partner violence homicide or something like that. And I also try to use those opportunities to talk about the issue of domestic violence. So I could talk about, we're using all of our tools. This person is going to go to prison and be incapacitated because he is not safe in the community. And we need to do better on domestic violence. And so I've really tried to lean into that to make sure I'm talking about all of the tools that we use. And hopefully that helps people understand my approach. But certainly it is sometimes frustrating, especially to see what the media did and how the media wasn't really, the first several months seemed to be, I can't remember how many articles with me talking about adolescent brain development and a family that was angry at me. I don't know how many times you can do that story without actually talking to experts. What am I talking about here? And what does this mean? And also, I think lots of people would be surprised that I have signed off on sending juveniles to prison because we don't have alternatives. And so there have been cases where we have not done that, where my predecessors would have done that, and we have done it for very specific reasons. But that kind of dominates the media, dominates the narrative. And that's too bad, because I think we are doing so much great work right now that is really impacting the structure of the criminal legal system that really is going, and a lot of preventative work too, that I think really is going to make people safer.
For the juvenile cases, and I don't know all of them. I follow many things, but I don't know all of them. There's been a couple of high-profile decisions that you've made. And one of them, you had made a case for someone not to be tried as an adult, I think was the case.
That was a case where a 15-year-old was accused and did kill a woman. And he was manipulated by an adult to do that. And we knew all about that. A 15-year-old is a child, and it's not that a 15-year-old doesn't know right from wrong or doesn't do something heinous. But I think what people probably don't understand completely is at that age, there's so much development that happens where we really do have an opportunity to rehabilitate. And what we know is if we send children to prison, they rarely do well. And they are going to come out at a very young age and maybe engage in violence. So what was frustrating to me about that, and I sit with a lot of families. That's something that's been very moving to me. And victims' families and victims want all kinds of different things, and they have every right. They have every right to want what they want. And I think our job is to look at it from a public safety perspective here. We do take into consideration what families of people who've been harmed want. But I had a mom who wanted the death penalty for the death of her daughter. And I understand that. And she has every right to ask for that. But we don't have the death penalty here. And if we did, I don't believe in the death penalty. But my job is, and our job is to be hopefully really focusing on what is in the best interest of public safety. And sometimes that is sending a young person to prison, unfortunately, because we don't have alternatives.
I think that the reason why I wanted to bring it up, one, is because it was sort of a case where I understood exactly where you were coming from because I know you. Mm-hmm. And this idea that this kid or any kid, right, that case or any case, that to your point is that if they go as a juvenile, they're not going to be there for life. And when they come out, they can in fact not have what they needed to reform, the type of support. And so I think that where you were headed is that they will get more support and intervention outside of prison than in prison.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the other point that you're making is that, public, we're out here and we're like, this person killed someone, they need to go to prison because that is the only method of correction, in air quotes, that people know. That's the consequence for doing those things, is prison. And so how do you shift people to, especially in a moment of reform, when we want alternate options to policing on the streets, but have we had a conversation around alternate options to prison for reform? And do you think that conversation needs to be expanded?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that particular case that we're talking about happened in my second month. And we hadn't really had the opportunity to talk at all. And I would say we need to have much more of that conversation, because the criminal legal system for decades has said the value of your loved one's life or your injury is the length of time people go to prison. That's how it's been measured. We've always been about punishment. And so one of the things I've tried to talk about, and this came up in the second case that made a bunch of headlines, that young man was also 15 at the time he participated in this murder. But because it took so long for the Supreme Court to hear his case, he was actually in getting everything that the psychologist recommended that he needed, all the support in custody for 5 years. And he was flourishing. And so I thought that case was a really good opportunity to talk about this. Okay, he was 15 at the time this happened. The person he was with fired the shot that killed the other person. And just by virtue of the fact that it took the Supreme Court forever, lots of time to make the decision, he availed himself of every opportunity he had down in Redwood in different programs, right? So we got all kinds of reports from the people who worked with him, who interacted with him. And as you know, the difference between a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old, huge, right? He was not the same person as he was at the time he was out there participating in this act. And I completely understand why that's all frozen in time for the family, right? But so I thought it was a great case to have this conversation about punishment, right? If in a juvenile court, we are supposed to be about rehabilitation. That's what the court's supposed to be about. So if we're supposed to be about rehabilitation, and at the hearing, the original certification hearing, when he was 15, the psychologist, all the experts said he needs several years with therapy, with all of these things that he got. And then we can see that he's flourished under those circumstances. Should we then send him to prison? Mm-hmm. And to me, if you're talking about punishment, if that's what we should be about, then yes, we should send him to prison to punish him for his participation in that. But if we really want rehabilitation and we want to recognize, not that he was completely rehabilitated, because we do have issues with transition programs, right? What I've seen is young people thrive when they have structure, because they've never had that in their lives before. And so we set up a system to support him. And so I think that's a conversation we haven't had in the community. Are we about punishment or are we about rehabilitation? And I think that was such a great case to have that conversation, because we could see all of the positive things that he did. We could send him to prison, but you don't get the programming that you need in prison. And if you get it, it's at the very end of your prison term. So do we send him to prison to sit there and punish him, or do we support him in his continued rehabilitation? And I think that's a question that the conversation we need to have, and that people really need to think deeply about.
You came into this role following George Floyd's murder and the uprising, and ultimately increased attention on all things policing, criminal legal system, the judicial system. Like there's just more attentiveness and criticism around it, right? What are some of the sort of the biggest barriers or things that you wish sort of community knew as folks are moving in the direction of wanting more justice in this criminal legal system?
Probably the biggest thing, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, is that, for instance, with the Minneapolis Police Department, because that's often where the focus is, that we ought to be able to have discussions about the things like clearance rates or, things of that nature. It is not being anti-police to have a real discussion about where issues are. And I mean that about my office too. And I think one of the biggest problems I see is that there are people who just refuse to engage in that conversation. And, this was a frustrating thing that happened, for my first year, MPD would talk a lot about the revolving door and how juveniles never have accountability. And we didn't say anything about that, even though we understood clearly that we don't get a lot of those cases. MPD may arrest somebody. That doesn't mean they submit a case to us. And understanding that the clearance rates, and I go back to, so let me talk about clearance rates. The biggest deterrence to anybody is the certainty of getting caught, right? That's, that deters you from doing something if you know you're going to get caught. But the clearance rate for, let me just say, car thefts, and I use car thefts because that is something that people do report pretty reliably because of insurance, right? Other crimes, there are lots of times people don't report it. So, you've got to consider that. But car theft people do report. And the cases that, I think there was something like 7,500 cases, was it in 2023, cars that were stolen. The cases that MPD is able to send to us for potential charging, less than 2%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And I started talking about that. And then the criticism was you're finger pointing at MPD. Not my intent at all. There are really good reasons why it can be really hard for MPD or any other law enforcement to make an arrest in a car theft. We see multiple people in a car. They're wearing masks. You have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that person took the car or that when they're in the car, they knew it was stolen. So I don't think it's criticism of police to say, hey, they're having a really difficult time bringing us cases to charge. And that means that it's not much of a deterrence. Mm-hmm. And you can talk about accountability, but we can't hold people accountable if cases aren't brought to us. Although it was our work with police that led us to develop the Youth Auto Theft Initiative, which we did come up with something where even if they couldn't bring us a case. But to your question is, we have to be able to have the conversation. It's tough, to bring in, to get us cases. There have been a number of situations since I've been in office with MPD, and we have to be able to talk about it. The same way we have to be able to talk about things that we might not be doing well, or the courts need to talk about that. And I think the biggest barrier are people in the community who just don't want to engage in that conversation, that anytime you try to bring up any issue, it's you're anti-police or, they're short-staffed or, that kind of thing. And we would all be much better. And I think community could see the reforms, some of the reforms that they're looking for, if we could have those real conversations about what's actually happening in the system.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And, you're reminding me of, I was brought in to do some facilitation with a group out of state that was working on reforms, reimagining public safety. And around the table, they had gotten to a point where half the table was abolitionist. And the other half wanted to support the police department on the reforms that they were moving forward. So they were sort of at the stalemate. They weren't able to sort of talk about it. It was really complicated because it was emotional, right? And one of the things that I know personally, right? I've had my cousin Chris, who I talk about a lot, who was murdered, right? That's a personal loss that, well, like my proximity to tragedy in that case was right up on it. And watching the system, in some ways it worked in terms of accountability and punishment, right, of the person who murdered him. But I for sure wanted him to go to jail, like for life. Like, I never want to see you again. You took my loved one.
Yep.
On the other side of this, right, I have worked in community and have encountered a lot of really good kids that have been in tough situations where they have been afraid. They have not had good family structure around them. They literally have done things out of survival, the need to survive, or in response to being afraid and not having adults that are there to protect or that had provided safety nets along the way, right? So you can see how they might end up in those circumstances. I've also had a son that's been beat up by the police, right? And I have family members that are police officers. So like my emotions are like all over the place. And I can imagine that if I only had proximity to one of those issues, that's where I would be, right? And I think it's one thing for the public that holds all of this emotion and doesn't often have the opportunity to see it from a system's point of view, to sort of land and be stuck on their point of view. Like, I get that. What I am having more challenge is that where can we or should we be working together between systems? And are the systems conversation convening at the level that we need to be convening to address the issue? Or maybe the way I should ask it is there agreement within the systems on the issues that we're trying to solve?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I want to say about your experiences, we have to be able to hold all of those experiences. We have to be able to accept the idea that there are police officers who beat up people in the community and mistreat them. We have to be able to accept the idea that there are people who enter the police force who want to do good things. We have to be able to hold the idea, the truth that we have a lot of gun violence, particularly in our Black community. We have to be able to hold the truth that we haven't done a whole lot about that. We have to be able to hold the truth that the clearance rates for non-fatal shootings, or frankly for shootings, are very low. And so sometimes we'll see that the same gun is used in a, shooting. And so all of those things are true. All of those things are true. And I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes we get in an emotional place where we're stuck on one part of that. Part of clearance rates too is actually community trust in police. And so if people aren't going to cooperate, if they're not going to tell the police what's going on, it's going to be harder to do those things. And, people's views about police can be what their views are, and they can hope for something different in the future. But we are where we are right now. And that's what I focus on. It's how do we improve? What is public safety really about? And to me, we need to sit down with police, with community, with people who work with young people, and to think about what are our solutions to gun violence, particularly. Mm-hmm. What can we do when we see inappropriate behavior by police? One of the things, I sometimes get accused of being anti-police. I am not. When I talked in my campaign about police accountability, I meant it from a number of different ways. And in my first year, we had much more communication with police than my predecessor ever had. We met with police once a month in 4 small groups, all the police chiefs in Hennepin County. I met with police chiefs 4 times a month. And I started out every meeting by saying, what are your issues? What do you want to tell me about? What are you frustrated about? What do you need help from us on? I appointed a really experienced prosecutor who was also a former police officer to be the liaison to them. And I said, you can call him anytime if if you think we're not charging, if you have a frustration with us, call him anytime. We worked on our youth auto theft initiative with them. So we spent a lot of time improving communication. We've told our people, don't just communicate with police via email, pick up the phone and call them and tell them, why are you declining a case? And one of the things I'm proud of that never happened before is we look at body cam, we look at video, and if we see some inappropriate behavior by police, we'll flag that for the chief, whatever chief it is. And I'm not talking about, assault level kind of stuff. I'm talking about sometimes language, sometimes, just stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And I remember having a conversation. We sent the video to the police chief. We set up a meeting with him and a training director and our liaison and me. And we went through the video, and there were some concerns about the language that were used and also the fact that they tased this child, essentially like 12 years old. And I said, I have concerns about the language and about the tasing. And we went through the video together, and they said, language completely inappropriate. Here's why he probably tased this kid, and walked me through it step by step. Now, I could see from his perspective, I still didn't think it was a good idea, and I still didn't think he should have done it, but I could see from his perspective what he was thinking. And the trainer said, this is a training issue, and we need to train him on why this was bad. And then we got to the end of the meeting, and the chief looked at me and said, what's next? With kind of an apprehensive look on his face. I said, nothing. I want you to know this because I trust you. You tell me you want to correct these things. And this is part of our partnership in working with you and flagging things that you otherwise wouldn't have seen so that you can go out and correct it. And if it continues to happen, we'll see it. If it escalates, we'll see it. So when I think about police accountability, I think about flagging that kind of stuff. I think about trying to work in partnership with our police to work on the issues that we see. And I think, unfortunately, many police are so in a bunker right now, feeling that they're attacked. It's a very, very difficult thing to accomplish and to do well.
Yeah. Do you have on your side, because obviously part of this conversation is about change, right? Like all of it. Right? Cultural change within MPD or whatever police department. It's also within your team and the way your team communicates and partners with others. Where do you think you have opportunity to partner better?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm very proud of is, and we do have opportunities to partner better, and we're always looking at that. But one of the things I'm really proud of, I've mentioned a couple of times, is our youth auto theft initiative. So when we were meeting with police chiefs from all over the county, they're all having similar problems. And they would tell us, hey, we know which kids are out there in the cars often, but we can't bring you a case that we could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we said, okay, so if we met with you and you gave us the names of these kids, and we ran them through our database and tried to offer them services, how do you feel about that? And they said, that's great. We just, we want these kids to get help. We see them over and over. They're engaging in risky, dangerous behavior that could hurt themselves or a member of the community. So we developed this initiative where we met with police as often as they wanted to. And now it's there's an email for it. I mean, we've really formalized it. And what it means is this, and this is not diversion, because to divert somebody, you have to have an actual case that you could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a completely new path that never existed in this office before. Because in the past, this office would have said, hey, you can't bring us a case, too bad. There's nothing we could do. We knew we wanted to help these young people. And we know, and this is kind of scary, when young people, we're talking about children, we're talking about 10, 11, 12, 13, when they engage in the car theft kind of stuff, that escalation to something more dangerous happens in a couple of months sometimes. And so it is critical for all of us to try to intervene as early as we can to stop that escalation and get that young person and their family help. So here's what we discovered. They would give us names. What we would do is screen the child through, did we have an open case in youth? We changed the name of juvenile to youth, but so I have to refer to youth. What about child protection? We can screen through child protection. We can't share that information even with our youth prosecution team, but we would screen, is there an open child protection case? We would send the name over to the county behavioral health and say, hey, is there an open something or another? The really surprising thing to me is that half of the young people were screened out, meaning that they had some services from somewhere. But half of them were screened into our program, which means half of these young people who were engaging in this kind of behavior were not receiving any services of any kind from anyone. And so when we started it in June, we used our social worker for our Be at School program, which is our truancy diversion program. And he would call the caretaker, the parent, and say, hey, your kid is on the radar screen here. One of the things that was notable was 100% of those parents, caretakers said, I know, please help. I need help. I don't know what to do. Yeah. And so what we would then do is reach out and kind of get them to services that were in the county, the community, whatever it is they need. Sometimes they don't have a place to live. Sometimes they don't have food. Sometimes they don't have clothing. Sometimes it's really basic stuff like that. Sometimes it's more complicated. And so we looked at the data after a year, and it had an 81% success rate. In other words, those kids that were receiving voluntary services, and the families, it's not just the kid, it's the family, were not coming back referred for cases. Now, those numbers have gone down a little bit, which isn't surprising, but it is still successful. And every kid that we can keep from coming into the system and interrupting that behavior is a success to me. So that's a huge partnership. And it's been so successful that police chiefs around the county have said, can you expand it to include, not just kids on car theft? And we would like to do that, but we need, more resources from the county. So that's one area we can, that we have been partnering. And certainly there are areas for improvement where we can partner. We also need willing partners on the other side to be willing to work with us.
There's a couple of things that you said. One is I know that when I have shared along my journeys, the ages of the kids that are still in cars, they're very young. Right. And we've seen some very public cases. There was, the 5 kids that were shot. We have noticed this trend from across the country, but these are very young kids, 11, 12, 13, 10 in one case that hit the news here. I think that is a very different image of who people think are stealing the cars. So my question here is, the program that you just talked about obviously has some dependency on community partners or others, right, to get them services perhaps, or no?
Well, we refer our social work, and that program shifted from our Be at School social worker to the social workers that are embedded with police departments. Okay. So they will refer the family to whatever they need. And often it's a county-based program. But the county does contract with community as well. I got you.
By the way, I used to run the Be at School program. I was around when it got started.
You did?
I did. Wow. I know, at Pillsbury. And so the truancy program. And so are you seeing a connection? I don't know if you can even answer this, between the kids that aren't in school and the kids that are out sort of with idle time and committing these crimes? Like, is there a connection, and is there something that we should be thinking about with our schools?
Yes, I would say that I see this all the time and obviously a lot of these kids, some of it is minor mischief going all the way up to major problems. Whenever I look at the reports that I get on a young person, often 16, 17, that kind of thing, who's committed a violent crime, I look at their history and they have not been in school. They have not been in school. We are seeing a school absentee crisis at the moment, as you know. And one of the things that we've done is to expand Be at School greatly. We also got a grant to get what we call 2 liaisons for 2 schools. And that came out of a convening we had with school board chairs and superintendents last year. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we noticed is that we're not getting referrals to Be at School in a very timely fashion. And so we're missing out on opportunities to intervene with those young people. And what schools told us is very often they don't have the resources to identify when the kids aren't there. And so we are piloting a program right now with our grant where we have 2 liaisons placed in 2 middle schools, one in Brooklyn Park and one in St. Louis Park. And it's early, but I had kind of a presentation from them on the kind of work they're doing. One was allowed to contact families who weren't actually registered, or the kid wasn't registered for school, and was able to get kids registered, was able to work out all the, those hurdles that, get your shots, all of this to get kids in school. And they were telling me these wonderful stories. I mean, they're embedded in the schools. And, one of them was saying there's a kid who was sleeping during class. And she said, "Hey, what's up?" And he said, "Oh, I'm staying up too late, I'm doing whatever I do." And she said, "Hey, what can we do about that? Because you got to be present. You got to be awake and engaged in school." And she had a good relationship with him. And he said, "You're right, I need to do better," and started doing better. I mean, it's that being in the school, noticing when kids aren't there, and even noticing when they're struggling in some way and saying, "Hey, what's going on? How can we help you?" I am really excited about that program. We don't have data yet on it, but I am a big believer in we need to expand those types of resources to make sure we are identifying when kids aren't in school and try to get them there and identify if they're there, but there's just, something going on at home probably, and see if we can identify how to help them, because I think it's just huge. We need kids in school. I don't think anything good happens when kids aren't in school. And, because of the pandemic, they had nothing to do. Yeah. They had nothing to do. And I think the social contract, the idea that school was something you had to do kind of, isn't there as much as it was. So there are all kinds of factors there, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to figure out, how to help young people get there and how to work with the family about, some really, I say simple, but being unhoused or on shelter, not having food. I mean, how do you go to class when you're hungry? How do you engage? And what if you only have one set of clothes? I mean, some of the issues are that straightforward, and we can help with that.
Yeah, I'm struck. I mean, we've talked about, a number of things, sort of public sentiment, partnership, other types of intervention that don't include being locked up. But I'm wondering now if we can what does the county attorney's office do? I mean, just in general, can you give us an overview of actually what is the scope? What do you do?
Yes. In fact, when I was campaigning, I would say, "Do you know what a county attorney does to people?" And they had no idea. Then I would say, "What about a DA?" And they would say, "Oh, yeah, I think I've seen that on TV." And I think most people's idea is criminal prosecution. So we have many divisions. Certainly criminal prosecution is one of them. We have adult prosecution. They do our most serious, our violent crimes. We have community prosecution, and that is a lot of drug property stuff. And we're taking a public health approach to that, understanding that people who struggle with substance use need help and intervention that way. So, and we're expanding diversion programs there. We have youth prosecution. We prosecute, by the way, we have jurisdiction over all youth in Hennepin County. So that can be misdemeanors, but we really only have jurisdiction over felonies, some gross misdemeanors in Hennepin County, but the city attorney's office handles misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors. We have child support. And we're trying to approach that in a different way. I mean, this is kind of something most people don't know, but We do have child support. And sometimes in the past, there's statutory guidelines and we can ask for a certain amount of child support. And the question we ask is, should we? Sometimes if you just say, hey, this is what we are allowed to ask from you, sometimes people feel overwhelmed and just put up their hands and say, why do I even bother? I can't do that. And so trying to figure out how to meet the person where they are and keep them engaged is something that we're working on. We have child protection, obviously a big area. We have an entire civil division that represents all county departments and the county board. We have adult services, which is an interesting name. It is commitments, commitments for mental health issues, substance use, that kind of thing. So we have, and I hope I'm not missing one, I probably am, but we do a lot of work that people don't know about. And we came up with a brand new strategic plan when I was here for about 6 months. And that was based on a lot of listening. I didn't come in here with, I wanted to hear people and see what people had to say here. And so we've been working on, we kind of say to people, what problem are we trying to solve? When I had a listening session early on, and I remember one of our prosecutors saying, well, I don't like it when some public defenders say, why are you asking, or, when I ask for 20 days in jail? And I said, well, why are you asking for 20 days in jail? And he couldn't answer that. And that's how the system has functioned. We kind of do the things we've always seen done. We do the things without really interrogating, hey, what does this do? And as you know, you could send somebody to jail, the workhouse, for 20 days. They could lose their housing. They could lose their job. It could completely
their children.
It could completely destabilize their lives so that they are more likely to be back in here on another offense. So what we're working on is, what is the problem before us? What are we trying to solve? What tools do we have to be able to do that? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a guiding principle.
Yeah, I know you as someone that's always looking for sort of a better way of doing the work. Do you feel like you have the freedom to do the types of reforms that you're thinking about?
A lot of it. I am an elected, so I am able to make a lot of decisions. What I didn't do is come in here and make pronouncements. In fact, it was so funny. I came in and the biggest question I got asked from people is, are you going to fire all of us? No. And I'm like, no, absolutely not. First of all, that's not me at all. And you're actually in a union. So no, you're okay. But people, with change, people don't deal well with change and uncertainty. Like, what is this going to mean? And I was very careful not to come in and dictate what we were going to do. I took a lot of time to listen to people. To hear what their issues were. It's very different being on the outside of an office and coming in. And I wanted to understand the culture. I wanted to understand some of the problems. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have worked on all of our policy stuff with our current staff. I want, when we're thinking about issues, to have different perspectives. I want people, if they disagree, to say something. And then we come up with hopefully the right direction. So we have created an entirely different division, 2 entirely different divisions. One is our professional standards division. We have completely revamped how we handle Brady. People hear that a lot. Essentially what it means is the information that we are constitutionally required to hand over to the defense. And it is often something that doesn't happen when you look at how somebody got wrongfully convicted. That became very apparent in our, about a month ago. Mr. Barrientos Quintana was somebody that we agreed to vacate his conviction because we believed he was innocent. And that was the Attorney General conviction review team that made that recommendation. But our office didn't hand over a lot of material that clearly made it pretty clear that he was innocent. So, and we have created a conviction integrity team that is taking applications now. We just finished our 3rd community expungement clinic that is going out into the community and helping people get their records expunged. So we're doing a lot of different things. And sometimes it's subject to FTEs, resources I can get from the county. They were very generous last year, and so we were able to do that. We also created, so when I came in, we have a staff of over 500, and we had 1.5 positions for community engagement. And they were buried, I think, in child protection. And so I created an entirely different division of community affairs. And as you know, I was very fortunate to get Jen White to lead that division, and she's great. And so we're building out community engagement because it's so important. We're building out restorative practices right now with Glenn Bird, you also know. And so we're doing a lot of work with community, understanding that this system is very reactive and it does things to community. And really being out there and talking about and listening to how people are impacted and what we can do better is really important to me. And also getting things like, we completely revamped our, it's a piece of immigration, our UT visa policy. That's to get some, victims of crime, some status, so that they can come in and testify, or at least not get deported when they're victims of crime. And it's really important because a lot of times, they get victimized. They're very vulnerable and they're more likely to be victimized. And sometimes they see crimes. And so there are many reasons that we want them to not get deported and to stay here. And so we've expanded that. But sometimes when people don't know what you're doing, they're still scared, right? So really getting out there and telling people what we're doing and that we have these tools is important. Otherwise, if nobody knows, it's not as helpful.
Yeah. And, I've been part of a lot of sort of change efforts in this city and beyond, and it's often very hard to communicate. It's like change happens slow and it feels like it happens fast at the same time. It's this weird sort of dynamic where I can't keep up with public communication, which is really important. And if you communicate too soon and you don't have all the answers of what you're envisioning, people will, it's just such a balance of things. But what I'm thinking about now is that if people wanted to learn more about what was happening in your office, where would they go?
I would recommend YouTube. We have a Hennepin County Attorney's Office YouTube channel. We have a bunch of explainers on there. They're kind of 1 and 2 minute explain what, for instance, competency. That's been in the news lately when somebody is found incompetent to face charges. What does that mean? We have all of our press conferences on there and a lot of helpful videos, which I think would be great. I mean, last week we did, and I would like to get the word out there on this. In 2023, the legislature passed a red flag law. It's called Extreme Risk Protective Orders. It went into place.
ERPO for guns.
ERPO, yep, ERPO. But I would guess if nobody knows that we actually have that in Minnesota. And so I hired somebody, Raina Alexander, to coordinate an ERPO response in Hennepin County. So she has been doing an amazing job helping train law enforcement. That's another way we partner with law enforcement, training them because people were confused. How does this work?
How does that work? So if I have a mental illness, or if I was in suicide ideation or something like that, and I had a gun.
Even broader than that. So these can be filed by a household member, and which is nice because a lot of people don't want to go to the police when a loved one. So they can be filed by a household member, law enforcement, or our office. And Raina's doing training, we're going to be doing training with community organizations so that they know how to help people file them. But if it's broader than that because you don't actually have to have a gun. And I tell you a story about that.
Okay.
We had a household who was fearful their loved one was making threats to go buy a gun to kill herself. And so they filed one. It got into a database. The woman went to a store to buy a gun, and that flag popped up, and they wouldn't let her buy a gun. Now, horribly, gun violence is actually the leading cause of death for juvenile young people. But 6 out of 10 instances of gun violence are suicide. And what's really important is, because it's a gun, to delay that time between the thought and the action. So the idea, and access too. So at least this family bought her some time. She couldn't get a gun and she was mad about it. I understand. But it worked to buy her some time to think about her action. There have also been instances where somebody's made threats online. I'm going to shoot up a school, or, something like that. So it can come up in a lot of different ways. It's a civil order. And so all the documents are on the court website. And I know that's not always accessible to people, but they can file them, and there's a hearing. So a judge can do an emergency one where law enforcement has a warrant and that they can actually go pick up the gun.
And so I think the exciting thing here for community is that you don't have to go through law enforcement.
You do not.
That if that is what you're afraid of.
We have that press conference on there.
Okay.
I know I just did an interview with the Strib, so I expect something to come out there. And we're going to be putting a lot more out there. We have a 1-page document that we'll be putting out there. But it is exciting because it's not a crime. Nobody has to be engaged in committing a crime. It can be threats. It can be the, suicide kind of thing. It can be concern about a neighbor. It can be something like that. But you don't have to go through law enforcement. It does not require, there's a document that has some pretty good instructions on it. The judge may sign it right away. The judges here are taking very quick action on them. And then within 14 days, there's due process there, and the person can say, hey, I want my gun back. What was exciting to me was Everytown USA reached out to me last year and said, hey, would you like some technical help on this? And we talked through what they're seeing around the country. And in many cases, the person will voluntarily surrender the gun, which they have to be given the opportunity to do that. And that's great. I mean, obviously less risk for everybody, but it doesn't have to be force your way in the house and take away the gun. It can be, hey, we're concerned about you. And, how about surrendering the gun? It's not forever. You can get it back at some point. And so many, many people do voluntarily surrender the gun. So I'm excited about it because it's an additional tool to prevent. And I'm always looking for that because I meet with so many families whose loved ones have been lost or the victims of gun violence. And I'm always thinking this could have been prevented. We could have prevented this. We need to do better to prevent it because what we do in the system is very reactive. And, certainly we send people to prison for long periods of time. And I know that doesn't, that's not restorative. It's not, for they've lost their loved one. That loved one is never coming back.
I know some of how you got into this work. What has inspired or led you to be in this work, and what has informed you really seeing the humanity in folks that have committed, in some cases, violent crimes, or that have the potential to? Like, what has guided you to see the humanity and not just the crime committed?
Yeah, I think part of the way I was raised actually was to see people as people. And my dad was a public defender, and so I would go to the jail in New Ulm and meet his clients. And so I got to know people as human beings, as neighbors, as moms, as dads, and certainly as a public defender. I would talk to my clients who unfortunately were way too many young Black men and, see them for who they were and see what their struggles were. And I often realized that they had experienced tremendous trauma, and that had we intervened with that trauma, they probably wouldn't be next to me. But I think it's an understanding that so many of us experience trauma, whatever that is. And, the saying, hurt people hurt people. And one of the things I always understood, and this was not the case way back then, I would see prosecutors who had in their head some idea of a perpetrator and then an idea of a victim that was somehow stereotypically pristine. And I understand none of that is accurate, right? I mean, in my mind, I don't care. Nobody deserves to be the victim of a crime. It doesn't matter to me, whatever you were doing, nobody deserves to be the victim of a crime, period. And people who even commit terrible things, there's much more to them. At the same time, I understand that often they have to be incapacitated because they're not safe in the community. But that doesn't mean I have to hate them, that I can't recognize their humanity and what led them here. And so I think all of that background has really helped me here. And I've been very moved by conversations I've had with victims and victims' families, in that their struggle to understand. I had a very moving discussion. It actually was with the victims of Nudie Land, and they're abolitionists. And we had a number of discussions about how they felt about things. And I say this because it's already public. Caitlin, who lost, her loved one, the love of her life, August Golden died in that shooting. And she was at a hearing for the juvenile, one of the people who didn't fire the shots, but he was part of it. And she gave such a moving victim impact statement that the judge wanted to pause after it and ordered the transcript so that the young man could have it to look at, because she talked about his humanity. And she's talked to me about that. And she understands where he came from and the trauma he experienced. And yet, she's grappling with you took the love of my life away and he'll never come back. It was called Nudie Land. They called it that. It was a place, kind of a safe space for LGBTQ folks to hang out in a backyard. And these two young men just dropped by and things happened. And one of them opened fire and shot 7 people, killing one of them. And so, to watch her struggle and to watch them struggle with, I love you and I hate you. I hate what you did, but I don't hate you as a human being. I understand where you came from. I understand why this happened. And one of the things she said to me that I won't forget is, none of what you're doing in this system is helping me. And she's right. She's right. And this one reason why we're developing restorative practices on more violent offenses, because I see, and I always saw victims come in with all kinds of questions like, why did you do this? And I truly believe that those 2 young people involved in Nudie Land and the 6 surviving victims at some point would really benefit from restorative practices. If they're ready.
They come together and they have an open conversation to be able to respond, right, to both accountability, right? But also with the understanding that the lack of forgiveness is also very harmful in community, right? An inability to forgive. It's, they need to, this is where true accountability is, I think. We can send people to prison. That's actually not accountability. It's punishment. And that needs to happen sometimes. But I think the true work is having to face what you've done. Yeah. And those 2 young men need to hear, and did. One of them did hear, but hear who August Golden was. And I continue to believe, had they known that community, known him, this wouldn't have happened. They never had that before. And this is a community that wants them to know they are cared about. They are seen as humans. They're not seen as the other. They're 2 young Native men, by the way. And I think that's what's so much of what's missing in what we do. It's harmful to everybody, and it doesn't lead to
repair at all. And I think we really need to expand that.
As I listen to this more, I think that it's so easy to simplify in our minds what is extraordinarily complex. System change is complex. The system is complex, right? Like you named out sort of the scope of the work, and ability to hold, I think is a good thing, right? Like you can hold both, someone's humanity and want them to be held accountable for something that they did. We can want the system to reform, and also know it takes a while for it to actually do that. There's just all this complexity that sits around this issue. And I think what's great about this conversation is that even in the middle of sometimes what we don't see, it feels like there's been some progress made to find alternates that didn't exist before. I think my question here is, if there was a legacy of leadership that you have, what would it be? Do you know what that would be?
Yeah, I do. I think about it when we're hiring, and we've been able to hire a lot of people who really want to do this work in a different way. And I think it would be putting in place structural changes that people understand work and keep us safer. I don't want to, whenever I'm not doing this to all go away. I want to put in the structures. I want to demonstrate that this is what true public safety is. I want, one of the really harmful narratives that prevents, it frustrates me very much. We even here have seen the narrative of super predator coming up again. Mm-hmm. And it's so easy to, portray, especially young Black men, frankly, in a way that scares everybody. And so one of my goals is as much as we can be talking about everybody who's in the system, and that people do things because of their circumstances. And it doesn't mean they're not to be held accountable. People have to be held accountable, but we have to be able to see everybody in that light. We have to be able to see young people in a different light, and we have to want to help all of our young people. We have to understand, if we invested our resources in helping all of our young people, we would have so fewer problems. We wouldn't have, it would just dramatically change. Yeah. So I want people to be thinking about that and to see from this system, hey, there's something like the Youth Auto Theft Initiative works to keep people out of the system. Prevention is what we should be looking for. But I really want people, I think, and this still exists today, there's public safety over here, and there's me, and I'm pointing my hands probably, and there's me doing something, whatever I'm doing. I want people to understand they're the same thing, that what we are doing here, and we're doing a lot of different things, is all about public safety.
I've been doing stuff with the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which has been blasted all over the place during the presidential election. Right. But one of the things that I tell people all the time is that the Freedom Fund does not set bail. A judge does. And the only thing that we can do is look at what we've laid out as a filter for decision-making to say that if the person had the resources, they would bail themselves out. So money is the factor.
Yes.
But there is something around the languaging of people coming in and out, which ultimately is about the perception and reality of safety.
Yes.
And we do have to do a better job collectively of thinking through, how safe do we want our city to be? And if we want it to be safe, then we have to start having more upstream solutions. We have to start thinking differently, because what has been has not worked.
Exactly.
And, I certainly appreciate the way that, you've come in and the reforms that you have had, or that you're making within the office, particularly the way that you interface with community. So, I can really appreciate that. And to take on something that is so big on everyone's radar doesn't feel like a easy undertaking. So I just want to thank you, and thank you for taking the time to be in this conversation with me.
Yeah, and I want to say to that, one of my goals too, I think this criminal legal system has purposely been made mysterious, because then community doesn't even know the questions to ask, right? And so one of my goals is to make it accessible. And that means talking about it in plain language. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to talk to you. I'm always trying to be out there talking to community. I want to be able to explain it, because another legacy, if you want to call it that, is that people in community can understand the system enough to articulate what they want. Because I think they know some of what they want, but they don't know how to penetrate the system and ask the questions to get it. And so I really want transparency. I want people to understand the data. I'm very transparent, and I'm very open to, I don't want to do things that aren't working. And if we're not doing something that's not working, we're going to do better. But to really help get access to this system so that people can insist on what they want. So thank you. There's so much. I was thinking about the bail conference. There's so much more to talk about, but I do have to go.
There is so much more. Yeah, and we can do this again too, because I think that, there's some conversations that feel like they're ongoing.
Yes.
Right. And, certainly I sit on reform and I sit on safety. I want to be safe. And I don't want people going to prison and having experiences that they shouldn't have because they made a bad decision when the proper intervention. So I'm going to sit on this conversation. I'm sure we'll be talking again. Mary, thank you so much for being in the conversation with Chanda.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to have had this conversation, and I hope we have more. I know we will have more.
If you'd like to explore more content and join our community, find us at conversationswithchanda.com. We have a wonderful collection of episodes featuring notable guests that you can enjoy on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And I also invite you to follow our journey and add us on Instagram at Conversations with Chanda. Until next time.